killing Sisera. And as was indicated, this is up north, Har Tavar, and there is a stream or a wadi called Nachal Kishon. And according to the understanding that we'll see from the Shiras Devorah itself, what happened was there was a flash flood and mud, and Sisera's army's chariots got mired in the mud. The soldiers tried to escape. They were stuck in the mud. Some of them were drowned, some of them were swept away, and others were killed because they were simply immobilized. So we are told, Perek Hey, and again, Perek Daled and Perek Hey are the Haftarah for Parshas Beshalach, which is Kriyas Yamsuf, because Nachal Kishon bears some similarities to the Yamsuf, and just as in the aftermath of Kriyas Yamsuf, we have the Shiras Hayam of Oz Yashir. So in the aftermath of the defeat of Sisera at Nachal Kishon, we have the Shiras Devorah, and the pasuk begins. We looked at the first pasuk. Vatashar Devorah ubarak ben Avinayim b'yamulemor. That day, they sang. Now again, just to remind you, I don't want to go over everything, that in biblical Hebrew, in the lashon of Tanakh, the word shira is lav dafka musical, meaning as yashir, shir is more like a poem rather than a music. So whether there was actual music or not, we're not sure. But this is described as Devorah is singing along with Barak. Now, we're not going to go over it pasuk by pasuk. Like all poetry, even in English, poetry is sometimes difficult to fully understand. And obviously, when you're dealing with poetry of Tanakh, it's also more difficult to understand. But I just want to go over the main themes in Shiras Devorah and point out a few different psukim. The very first part of Shiras Devorah seems to describe something that is a bit of a non sequitur, something that it's not really relevant here. She actually describes the revelation of Hashem at Har Sinai when he gave the Torah. And there's a bit of a description from Matan Torah. And I'll go over a few things. But the question becomes, why would that be relevant here? I mean, she doesn't talk about Kriyas Yamsuf, she doesn't talk about the Makos, she doesn't talk about Yetzias Mitzrayim. If anything, that might have been peripherally more relevant to the downfall of an enemy. But instead, she describes how HaKadosh Baruch Hu revealed his presence at Har Sinai. That's theme number one. So the obvious question in Pshat is, why would that be a theme of her Shira? That's not a military victory over enemies. So the simple explanation is that, remember, Devorah is not only the shofeta, she's not only the political leader, but she's a judge, meaning she paskin al pi halacha. And again, just to remind you, Tosfos and Gittin asked the kasha, how could Devorah be a judge? A woman is puzzled to be a witness. And whoever is puzzled to be a witness is puzzled to be a judge, a dayan. And Tosfos gives two answers. One answer is, this is a special divine dispensation, a yotzei min haklal, meaning a navi through nevuah can abrogate a halacha for a temporary situation. Or Tosfos gives another answer, that if the Balei Hadin, both of them, agree to submit their dispute, even to a pasul dayan, they can do so. Which means parties can agree that a woman will be their dayan. And Devorah could not order somebody to appear before her, but if people agree, they could bind themselves to her psak. I don't want to get into politics, but those two terutzim of Tosfos are very, very relevant. They don't answer it totally, but they're a very relevant factor in the discussion of, can there be women rabbis in an Orthodox synagogue? And some have made the argument, based on Tosfos, at least if you have unanimous agreement, now usually you won't have it, but if they agree, they could appoint anybody they want. So why can't they appoint a woman? Okay, as I say, there are other considerations there. Maybe it'll come up in a Q&A. By the way, somebody told me right now that the Rabbanut is being sued by some women who want the right to take smicha bechinas. Rabbanut gives smicha bechinas. So I think the Israeli Supreme Court, which is a secular body, is either has already ordered them, I haven't followed the story, or is on the verge of ordering the Rabbanut to let women take smicha bechinas. Now the Rabbanut will probably not agree to it, and then there'll be civil disobedience, and who knows what the Israeli Supreme Court will do, but that's actually an issue that's going on. They had a parallel issue, a different issue, about a kid, some brilliant Eloi, who took the smicha bechinas, and Rabbanut smicha is actually a hard test. It is a hard test, Rabbanut smicha bechinas, and the kid was only 14 years old, and he got a perfect score. But the Rabbanut didn't want to give him ordination because, we don't want to give smicha to a 14-year-old kid. So I think that went to court also about... Now, the Rabbanut's argument there was an interesting argument. Their argument was that to be a Rav is not just a question of how much you know. You can know a lot, right? The computer can know everything. But it also requires maturity, kind of judgment. And so even if somebody aces the test, they get 100% on a bechina of halacha, that should not necessarily qualify them for smicha. On the other hand, the counter-argument is that if somebody is 18 and takes the test, the Rabbanut does not give them a psychological profile to see what their judgment is. And rest assured, there are plenty of people who get smicha who may not be emotionally stable either. So it's why are you singling out the kids because they're bright? But okay, be it as it may. So everything is, every few years there's a new problem. A few years ago, it was young teenagers getting the smicha test. Now it's women taking the smicha test. Who knows? But at least with respect to that, the notion of a kahila accepting somebody is very relevant from the Devorah precedent. But going back to the point of Shiras Devorah, Deborah was not just a military leader. Deborah was a religious leader. She was considered to be the greatest in her generation. So as a result, it's very, very important that before she celebrates the military exploits, she indicates that ultimately all of our hatzlacha in the world comes from our connection to Hashem through His Torah. So before we start talking about the success of the army, we have to remember Matan Torah, which gave us our mission. And that is why, even though thematically, her discussion of Matan Torah seems to be out of place, it really does not fit the narrative here, but it's a necessary hakdama to understand that all success in military victory is important only because it enables us to keep Hashem's Torah. That, by the way, is, of course, a very important message in this day and age. This is exactly what we are going through right now. Again, I don't want to get too involved in modern and divisive political issues, but as you know, the whole issue of yeshiva, talmidim of yeshiva being drafted, etc. Again, for those of you who are not Israeli citizens, most of you are not, it's not relevant to you, Baruch Hashem, you're not going to face that issue, but if you're an Israeli citizen, learning in yeshiva, so there are going to be some very difficult situations because the law might very well require you to be drafted. On the other hand, we have to recognize that when Klal Yisrael loses people who are learning Torah, it is not just a religious issue, it's also a security issue. I mean, the security of Am Yisrael is endangered when we diminish the learning of Torah. Okay, so in a sense, this is what Shiras Devorah is telling us. Shiras Devorah is telling us, hey, before we talk about military victories, let's remember that the foundation of everything is the Torah that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave her. Now, let me point out that Chazal actually derived this, one of the important ideas. Remember that there's a Gemara in Avodah Zarah that says, before HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave the Torah to Am Yisrael, HaKadosh Baruch Hu offered the Torah to all the different nations of the world. And all of the different nations of the world, all of them asked, well, what's in the Torah? So if for one nation it says, oh, don't steal, they say, well, we can't accept that one. Don't murder. We can't accept that one. Until Hashem came to Klal Yisrael, and Klal Yisrael, what did Klal Yisrael ask? The answer is they didn't ask. That was their greatness. They just said, Naseh v'nishma. We will do even before we know. So one of the sources, the Gemara has a few sources, but one of the sources that Hashem went to other nations before going to the Jewish people is from Pasuk Daled in the Shira, where Devorah says, Hashem b'tseischa mi seir, b'tzadecha mistei adom. Hashem, when you came out of Seir, Seir is Esav's territory, south of Eretz Yisrael, when you trampled from the fields of Edom, of Esav, Eretz Ra'asha, it was like an earthquake. The earth trembled, Gam Shamayim Natafu, and the skies were dripping water. So again, what that means I'll get to in a moment. But the fact that it describes Matan Torah as Hashem coming from Edom implies that Hashem was coming from offering the Torah to at least one other nation, which was Esav. Edom and Seir are synonyms for Esav. So this is one of the sources. Of course, people ask the kasha. It's a very, very good kasha. Okay, granted, Hashem knows the end of the story. God knows the future. So God knew that they would all say no. But here's the problem. Let's imagine Esav would have said yes. Give us the Torah. Well, what Torah would Esav have gotten? I mean, the Torah gives the story. I mean, Esav is mentioned in the Torah, but not necessarily in a complimentary way. I mean, Esav would get a Torah that talks about Yaakov taking the brachos from Esav. Esav gets a Torah that Dabero b'nei Yisrael. And the Torah is the history of the Jewish people leaving Mitzrayim. Esav was not in Mitzrayim. And all of this is after not after Matan Torah, but it's after Yetzias Mitzrayim. You can't go backwards. I mean, if Esav at the time of Matan Torah says, yeah, I want it. So what's going to happen to the story of the Exodus in which Esav did not participate? It is a very good question. I mean, our assumption has to be, although this may sound a little heretical, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu had, just like they say the defense departments in America, and I'm sure in Israel as well, has contingency plans for every type of battle. Like, what if Madagascar attacks Cambodia? Like, what will the U.S. do? Like, every possible configuration. HaKadosh Baruch Hu has all sorts of Torahs. There would have been a Torah which would have been written from an Edomite perspective and the like. We don't have that Torah. We don't know, because that Torah never got revealed, because there was no need to reveal it. But I think it's a Deborah Pasha. It certainly would not have been. The Torah that Bnei Esav would have gotten would not have been the 5 books of Moses. That wouldn't be Shaykh at all. But okay, be it as it may, though, one of the sources that God offered the Torah to other nations was this pasuk. Now, here, Devorah describes, though, in Matan Torah, she describes the climactic conditions. She describes earthquakes. She describes water coming from the sky. And she's using it in a metaphorical way, and that is the changes of nature are reflecting the awe and the fear and the pachad that even the inanimate world has when Hashem is revealing His presence. Okay, this is the perspective she's bringing. The Shekhinah comes into the world. The earth trembles and shakes in fear. The sky sweats, right? The sweat of the sky is described as rain, right? When one is afraid, you start sweating, right? So the sky is sweating. The earth is shaking. And then it mentions the mountains melt, so to speak. Now, this is very reminiscent, and maybe David HaMelech borrowed from Shiras Devorah. in Hallel, the Hallel in Tehillim of David HaMelech, right? So there it's describing Kriyas Yamsuf. It's not describing Matan Torah. But it does talk about the mountains shaking and quaking. Right? Malacha Hayam Kisanis, that's Kriyas Yamsuf. Why the sea is running away. Hayardain Tisov Liachar, the Jordan splitting in the time of Yoshua. Okay, so Malacha Hayam Kisanus is Kriyas Yamsuf. Hayardain Yisov Liachar is the time of Yoshua. Heharim Tirkadu Kielim. This is in Hallel. The mountains were shaking like young rams that kind of move around. Givaos, the hills, Kivnei Tzon, like sheep. So in Hallel itself, it describes something about the mountains shaking and quaking. That's referring to Matan Torah. And that's based, I'm not saying it's based, but it's the same. It might be based because Shiras Devorah is earlier than Tehillim. And Devorah talking about the mountain. Now it doesn't say the mountains. Okay, so it says the earth is shaking. In her description of the mountains melted in fear. So it's a little of a different image. David HaMelech used the mountains are shaking. Devorah uses the earth is shaking, and the mountains melt in fear of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. What that specifically meant at Matan Torah, I'm not sure. Meaning, I understand earthquakes, and I understand rain, torrential rain coming down, which is like as if the sky is afraid of God's Gilui Shechina. What does it mean that the mountains melted? Meaning the mountains got lower. I'm not really sure, but metaphorically, it seems to be describing the idea that when God's presence enters the world, the mountains, the tallest mountains, are no longer barriers, so to speak. It's as if they melt before God. Okay? So this is, and this is because Sinai, this is what happened at Har Sinai. Mipnei Hashem Elokei Yisrael. In the presence of Hashem, the God of Israel. So Pasuk Aleph Tehei has nothing to do with this Nitzachon. Aleph Tehei is a description of Matan Torah, but the emphasis in the Matan Torah part is on how all of nature was filled with fear and moira upon the revelation of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's Shekhinah. Chazal say that when one learns Torah, one should learn Torah bi'ema u'v'yira, with fear and reverence, bereses, trembling, u'bezeya, and sweating. It actually uses the term sweating. Right? That idea of fear. And again, for various reasons, we don't insist on that so much today. But there was that idea of feeling the presence of Hashem when you learn Torah. Okay, so as I say, it doesn't directly belong here other than to underscore the idea that all military victory is significant only when it's linked to Matan Torah. Okay. Now, starting from Pasuk Vav, Devorah describes how difficult life was under the rule of Yavin, Melech Hatzor, who was Sisera's boss. And she says, Chodlu arachos. Arachot, orech is an open road. Chodlu arachos is people were afraid to walk on open roads because there were marauders, there were bandits, there were harassment. Every time you walked, you could be attacked, you could be robbed. I had mentioned that the way Yavin ruled was a lawless type of rule. It wasn't like a foreign government, but rather every Jew was vulnerable. So this is described with chodlu arachos. People were afraid to walk on open roads. And holchei nesivos, and those who did have to travel on roads, yelchu arachos al kalkalot. They would take crooked shortcuts, because in other words, the main highways were taken over by hooligans and bandits and ruffians. So if you had to get somewhere, you would kind of take a back exit that may have doubled or tripled, right? A crooked path to escape the attackers. And chadlu prazon, and whatever Jewish communities existed. Remember from Megillah, right? You remember from Lashon Megillah, we make a difference in the laws of Purim between cities that are walled cities, these are called mukafin, and cities that are open cities, they are called orei haprazos. So what does the Megillah say without getting into the reasons for this? The orei haprazos make Purim on the 14th of Adar. The mukafin make Purim on the 15th of Adar, like Yerushalayim, if it had a wall from the days of Yoshua ben Nun. I'm not going to go into that, but other than to note that prazos means cities without walls, open cities. So Devorah says, in those days, chodlu perazon. Jewish communities no longer trusted themselves with open cities. If we had a little community, we built a wall around it to at least protect us from having the city itself invaded. This, by the way, was a big issue in the 19th century. You know, all the shchunot, I mean, basically the city of Yerushalayim as we know it, did not exist until the end of the 19th century. Meaning, if you were to visit Yerushalayim in the 1850s, all you would see is the old city with kind of Bedouins around, or little villages around. There were no communities outside of the old city, and part of that was because Jews were afraid of living outside the wall. They could be attacked by Arabs, they could be attacked by animals, and the like. And therefore, in fact, not only were they in the old city, but the old city was locked every night. They would lock the gates so nobody could enter. There literally was a curfew after a certain time, or there was a guard. If you were a Jewish person, they would let you in. Now, for the whole Jewish population, which of course was much smaller then anyway, but to all be confined in the old city was a breeding ground for starvation and disease. So the great British philanthropist, who was a frum person, Moshe Montefiore, who had made several trips to Eretz Yisrael, and he supported the old yeshiv, and he gave a lot of money to create communities beyond the wall. So the first community that was created beyond the wall, it's not a community today, now it's just I think it's a musical conservatory, Mishkanot Shananim. That means the dwelling places of the tranquil. You would know it by sight. It's like a long narrow building, only one story, that's kind of right next to the neighborhood of Yemin Moshe. So now they use it for concerts or events, but it actually was a dormitory. In other words, the deal was families agreed. They divided it into little apartments. Families agreed to live there in return for a stipend. Moshe Montefiore offered money to any family that would agree to live in Mishkanot Shananim. So what they did was, a little bit of Gnei Vastas, what they did was they would go there in the daytime, daylight hours, they would live there. So whoever checks would check them off the list, and they qualified for the stipend. But before nightfall, they would run back to the old city walls. They thought it was too dangerous to live outside. And that was true with a number of the neighborhoods. Mea Sharim was an early neighborhood. Yemin Moshe was an early... Yemin Moshe, by the way, the word Moshe is Moses Montefiore, etc. In fact, all of the neighborhoods with Moshe in it are connected to Moses Montefiore, who visited Yerushalayim, Eretz Yisrael, I think four times in his lifetime. So the point basically was, I'm just drawing an analogy, that people felt more secure in a wall. They wanted to be walled. But that's a sign of fear. That's a sign of pachad. That's a sign of insecurity. This is what Devorah says. Chodlu prazon. Cities or towns could no longer be open in the reign of terror of Yavin and Sisera. People had to hide behind gates and hide behind walls. Ad shekamti Devorah. So this is a little hard to understand because there seems to be a little bit of a boastful tone. Until I, Devorah, stood up and protected the nation, shekamti aim b'Yisrael. I arose as a true mother in Klal Yisrael, like the Imahos, and I was able to bring Hatzalah. There is a chazal, I have to remember the owners, I don't remember the owners, I'll try to look it up, that this particular line was considered to be a little bit improper, and Devorah was later nanash because of this idea of taking credit. Everything was rotten until I got up as a mother in Klal Yisrael to save the nation. Okay. Then she goes on, and these next psukim are a little complicated, but she basically says, Yivchar Elohim Chadoshim, so this is Elohim, not Elohim. When they choose foreign gods, then there will be war. So Devorah is making a point that we see in the book of Shoftim all the time, that when the Jewish people turn to Avodah Zarah, Hashem does not help them, and they are vulnerable to the enemy. So that's what Deborah says. When the Jewish people choose new and foreign gods, then there will be battle in the gates. And then she turns to express Hakaras Hatayv to the people who volunteered. Now again, just to remind you, the two tribes that were commanded to wage war, because this was primarily in the north, were Zevulun and Naphtali. They were commanded to wage war. And there were 10,000 soldiers of Zevulun and Naphtali that fought against Sisera. What we're going to see now, and you didn't see this from the actual narrative, we're going to see now that many other tribes volunteered to participate. And Devorah now expresses her gratitude to the tribes that participated and her musar and criticism of the tribes who didn't bother to participate. So this is both going to be a praise of the volunteers and a criticism of those who did not volunteer. So in terms of just mentioning a few here, down to
לתשומת לבכם, עקב התראה על ספר בבניין יש לפנותו בצורה מסודרת. חל איסור מוחלט להשתמש במעליות. יש להשתמש ביציאות לחירום בלבד. אינכם מתבקשים להישמע להנחיות אנשי הביטחון והחילוץ.
Okay, don't use the elevators. I don't know what else they said. Okay. So now, so remember,
לתשומת לבכם, עקב התראה על ספר בבניין.
I didn't hear the first thing. Because of what did they say? Oh, a fire alarm, is it? But there's no alarm. Okay, all right. No, I tell you about fire alarms. When I was in first grade, so I remember I was kicked out of class for something, I don't remember what, and I was experimenting. There was a fire alarm on the side of the wall, so I just wanted to see how far you could pull it down before it goes off. I was doing an experiment. And unfortunately, I pulled it a little too far, and whatever. So I know about fire alarms, but okay. But a guy who's now a Rebbe in Yeshiva somewhere in Eretz Yisrael, I remember he was in my grade, and he was eating lunch, and he said, "You have a big avera. You made me stop in the middle of benching." So it's been on my conscience since then. Yeah.
How far people look down?
Huh?
How far people look down?
Halfway. You can go halfway. If it's more than half, it goes up. Okay. Anyway, so the first tribe that she mentions, look at Pasuk Yudalit, interesting. Mini Ephraim. Now, Mini is poetic for min. Mini is not, the Yud has no meaning. It doesn't mean from me. Mini Ephraim, meaning min Ephraim, Shorsham Biamalek. So she praises Shevet Ephraim, who didn't have to come. Their root, their shirish, is from Amalek. So what does it mean, their shirish, their root, is from Amalek? They're not Amalek. The answer is this. Remember, when the Jewish people left Mitzrayim, the very first nation that attacked us when we left Mitzrayim was Amalek. That's why Amalek, remember the mashal Chazal give? When the Jewish people left Mitzrayim, they were like a boiling hot bath. Every nation was afraid of them because of the Makos. They wouldn't touch them. Don't mess with the Jews. Amalek jumped into the hot bath. What happens? They get scalded, they get burnt, but they make the bath a little cooler for the next guy. Right? This is why Amalek is so despicable. They represent the epitome of having no fear or reverence of Hashem when Hashem's revelation was at the highest. Now, when Moshe Rabbeinu said we have to wage war against Amalek, Moshe Rabbeinu designated, in fact, this is the first time he's mentioned, Hoshea ben Nun, who was later to be called Yehoshua. Hoshea ben Nun was the general who led the war against Amalek. What did Moshe do? Moshe went on a mountain, remember? He sat on a rock, and Aaron and Hur, who's Miriam's son, were on either side of him, and they lifted up his arms, and remember that as long as Moshe's arms were towards Shemayim, and people were looking towards Shemayim, they were Menatseach. When his arms became too tired, they were not Menatseach. Okay? But the actual milchama against Amalek was led by Yoshua ben Nun, who was called Hoshea then. Yoshua ben Nun is from what tribe? The tribe of Ephraim. So Devorah, I'll explain why that was so in a moment. Devorah was explaining that the root of Ephraim's heroism against the enemies of Hashem goes all the way back to their heroism against Amalek. That's Shorsham. The root of Ephraim's heroism was created in the war against Amalek. And what Devorah is saying is, this is Act 2, even though this nation was not Amalek, but they too were waging war against the nation of Hashem. And therefore they too are a type of Amalek that had to be defeated. Now, the concept of why the war against Amalek had to be Shevet Ephraim, although this is not a complete explanation, is that the Gemara says in Bava Basra that the children of Esav can only be defeated by the children of Rachel and not the children of Leah. Esav gets defeated by Bnei Rachel, not Bnei Leah. Now remember this. Remember, Amalek comes from Esav. Amalek is Esav's grandson. One of Esav's sons is called Eliphaz. Eliphaz took a concubine, not a regular wife, Timnah from Mitzrayim. And in the union between Eliphaz and Timnah is Amalek. So Amalek is from Edom, Esav. Ephraim is from Yosef. Yosef is from Rachel. So all the way back in the first encounter against Amalek, it had to be the children of Rachel against Amalek. You see this again in Megillas Esther, where Haman is from Amalek. Now, actually, before that, let's say Shaul, the king who was given the command to eradicate Amalek was not David HaMelech. It was Shaul HaMelech. Shaul is from the tribe of Binyamin. And because Shaul did not completely eradicate Amalek, David was not able to do so. That's why Haman eventually materialized. Because Amalek, Zerah Esav, can only be defeated by Rachel, not by Leah. Fast forward to the Purim story. Mordechai and Esther are descendants of Shaul from the tribe of Binyamin. Only they can orchestrate the downfall of Haman, who is from Amalek. And this also is why we need Mashiach ben Yosef before Mashiach ben David, because Mashiach ben Yosef will destroy Amalek and pave the way for Mashiach ben David. So you see a consistent pattern in at least 4 cases. Yoshua in the Midbar, from Shevet Ephraim. Shaul HaMelech given the commandment against Amalek, from Shevet Binyamin. Mordechai and Esther, Shevet Binyamin. Mashiach ben Yosef, and actually Mashiach ben Yosef is often called Mashiach ben Ephraim, who will be Machris, Zarei Shel Amalek, to prepare the scene for Mashiach ben David. Now, why sometimes the Zerah Rachel is Yosef and sometimes it's Binyamin? That's a good question. But the common denominator is Amalek always gets defeated by Zerah Rachel and not Zerah Leah. And the Meshech Chochmah explains that all of the children of Leah are tainted, including the maidservants, including the maids of the Shvachas, are tainted with Sinas Chinam in Mechiras Yosef. They all participated in Mechiras Yosef, which was an act of hatred. And because of that hatred, they are vulnerable to the hatred of Amalek. The only ones who did not participate in the act of hatred against Yosef were Yosef and Binyamin, who was too young. Memela, only Yosef and Binyamin have an immunity against the hatred of Amalek because they were not tainted by the hatred of the brothers who participated in Mechiras Yosef. So Devorah makes the point, going back to Shiras Devorah, that Ephraim's power in war stems from the fact that they, via Shevet Yosef, or Zerah Rachel, in a more general way, were given the power to fight Amalek. Okay, this is the Gemara in Bava Basra once again. Ein Zerah shel Esav Neifal ela mizarei shel Rachel. That Esav will be defeated by Zerah Rachel, will not be defeated by Zerah Leah. This is why Mashiach ben Yosef has to destroy Amalek before Mashiach ben David will come. Now, Lamaisa, this is not a Pasha thing because I see in the Gra's writings in the Even Shlema, it's brought down that Mashiach ben David will be Machris Esav. But l'chayra, that contradicts the Gemara in Bava Basra that I just said, that Ein Zara Shal Esav Neiflas Ella Miyad Zera Rachel Lo Zera Leah. So I don't know. I'm going to have to see how the Gra would be Miyashev. Obviously, the Gra had a teretz. How the Gra would be Miyashev, that Gemara in Bava Basra. Okay. Now, the next pasuk says, and after you, Ephraim, came Binyamin. So apparently Binyamin also joined the war. But once again, this makes perfect sense because Ephraim is from Yosef, Binyamin is from Binyamin. So all of it is Zerah Rachel, right? You see? So the Dvora is making the point that this koyach to be mashchis, these enemies, has to come from Rachel, and even more so than Leah. So the first two tribes that she mentions for honorary mention is Ephraim and Binyamin. And then she mentions Menashe. Now why she splits it a little bit, because I would have thought maybe mention Ephraim, Menashe, Binyamin, because Yosef and then Rachel, then Binyamin. For some reason, I don't know, I'll think about it a little bit. You can think about it. She does split it. She is Mishabeach Ephraim, then Binyamin, then Menashe. Now it might be, just I'll peep shot, that the order might just be the order in which they responded, meaning it's not a question of some lumdus here. It might just be Ephraim were the first people, Binyamin are the second people. Menashe is mentioned third because Menashe was third. Menashe did not come right away, so they're not entitled to the same level of appreciation. That's going to be it as well, because it could very well be Efsher that Menashe responded because they were embarrassed. Hey, Ephraim is going, Binyamin is going. We ought to go too. So she's mishabeach them, but she puts it in the bronze medal instead of the gold and the silver. Okay. So tomorrow we'll look at the other shvatim that she mentions and why that was so. Okay.
Thank you for listening to this Ohr Somayach production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.